Have you ever been called a failure by the one person whose approval you wanted most? Have you ever sat in a room full of people, smiling on the outside, while someone's words cut so deep you could barely breathe? What would you do if your own father, the man who was supposed to protect you, encourage you, believe in you, looked at you like you were nothing, like you were a mistake he wished he could erase? Marcus was 34 years old when he sat in that auditorium, watching his younger brother walk across the stage to receive his college diploma. The crowd was cheering. Camera flashes lit up the room. Proud parents wiped tears from their eyes. It was a beautiful moment for everyone except Marcus. Because sitting next to him, close enough that Marcus could smell his cologne, was his father, Richard. And Richard couldn't let the moment pass without reminding Marcus exactly where he stood in the family hierarchy. "Look at him," Richard said, nodding toward Daniel on the stage. His voice was thick with pride, a pride Marcus had never heard directed at himself. "That's my boy. Top of his class, full scholarship, already got job offers lined up." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then he turned to Marcus with a look of pure contempt. "That's what success looks like, Marcus. Not like you, a failure who couldn't even finish community college." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, absorbing the blow like he had absorbed 1,000 blows before. His father's words weren't new. Marcus had been hearing variations of them his entire life. "Why can't you be more like your brother? What's wrong with you? I don't know where I went wrong with you. You'll never amount to anything." The words had become background noise, a constant hum of disappointment that Marcus had learned to tune out. But that didn't mean they didn't hurt. They did, every single time. He just never showed it. Marcus had learned a long time ago that showing pain only invited more pain, so he buried it, deep, where no one could see, where no one could use it against him. But today, sitting in that auditorium, surrounded by happy families and proud parents, the pain felt sharper than usual. Maybe it was because Daniel really had done something incredible. Maybe it was because Marcus genuinely wanted to be happy for his brother, but his father's cruelty kept poisoning the moment. Or maybe it was because Marcus knew something that no one else in that room knew. Something that would change everything if it ever came to light. He glanced down at his hands. They looked ordinary, unremarkable. The hands of a quiet, forgettable man who had never accomplished anything worth mentioning. At least that's what his father believed. That's what the whole family believed. But those hands had done things that would give most people nightmares. Those hands had pulled wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles. Those hands had disabled explosives with seconds to spare. Those hands had helped dying men in foreign deserts, promising them that their sacrifice meant something. Those hands had saved more lives than Marcus could count, including lives that would never know they had been saved. But none of that mattered. Not here, not to his father. Because everything Marcus had done, every mission, every medal, every sacrifice, was classified. Top secret, buried in files that would never see the light of day. To the world, Marcus was nobody, a quiet man with no degree, no fancy job, no achievements worth celebrating. To his father, he was a disappointment, a failure, a waste of potential. And Marcus couldn't say a single word to defend himself. He had made peace with that a long time ago. He didn't serve his country for recognition. He didn't save lives for applause. He did it because it was right. Because someone had to. Because the men and women he served with became the family he never had at home. But sometimes, in moments like this, when his father's contempt was so thick he could choke on it, Marcus wondered what it would feel like to be seen, just once. To have his father look at him with pride instead of disappointment. To hear him say, "I'm proud of you, son," and actually mean it. Marcus pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. After today, he was done.
Done chasing approval he would never get. Done hoping his father would change. Done pretending that the man's opinion still had power over him. He would sit through this ceremony, he would congratulate Daniel, and then he would walk away from this family and never look back. That was the plan anyway. But life has a way of disrupting even the best plans, because as the ceremony continued, something unexpected happened. A man in full military dress uniform took the stage, Colonel James Warren. Marcus recognized him immediately. The sharp jaw, the silver hair, the chest full of medals that told a story of decades of service. Marcus's heart stopped. No, not here. Not now. Colonel Warren was there to deliver a speech about service and sacrifice, a standard part of these ceremonies, meant to inspire the graduates to think beyond themselves. Marcus had seen the program. He knew the colonel would be speaking, but he had hoped that in a crowd this large, he would go unnoticed. He was wrong. Colonel Warren stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the audience. His eyes swept across the sea of faces, parents, graduates, faculty, guests. And then his eyes stopped, right on Marcus. For a moment, neither of them moved. The colonel's expression shifted from professional calm to surprise, then to recognition, then to something that looked almost like reverence. Marcus's stomach dropped. He wanted to look away. He wanted to disappear into the crowd, become invisible like he had trained himself to be. But he couldn't move. The colonel held his gaze for what felt like an eternity. The audience began to murmur. People noticed the pause. They noticed the colonel staring at someone in the crowd. "What's wrong with him?" Richard muttered, beside Marcus. "Is he having a stroke or something?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. Because Colonel Warren was stepping away from the podium. He was walking to the edge of the stage, and he was looking directly at Marcus with an expression that made Marcus's blood run cold. Then the colonel did something that silenced the entire auditorium. He snapped to attention. His heels clicked together. His back went ramrod straight, and he raised his hand in a crisp, perfect military salute aimed directly at Marcus. Every head in the room turned. Hundreds of eyes landed on the quiet, unremarkable man sitting in row 15. Richard's jaw dropped. Daniel, still standing on stage with his diploma, stared in confusion. And Marcus, the failure, the disappointment, the son who would never amount to anything, sat frozen as the highest-ranking officer in the room saluted him like he was the President of the United States. "What the hell is going on?" Richard said, his voice shaking. He looked at Marcus like he was seeing a stranger. To understand how Marcus ended up in that auditorium, invisible, dismissed, carrying a secret that could silence every critic in the room, you need to understand where he came from. You need to understand the family that shaped him, and broke him, and accidentally turned him into the man he became. Marcus was born second. That might not sound significant, but in his family it meant everything. His older brother Daniel came first, and from the moment Daniel took his first breath, he became the center of Richard's universe. Daniel was everything Richard had dreamed of in a son. Bright, charming, athletic, social. He started talking early, walking early, reading early. Teachers loved him. Other parents envied him. Richard couldn't stop bragging about him. "That's my boy," Richard would say, beaming with pride. "He's going to do great things. I can already tell." And then, 2 years later, Marcus arrived. Quiet, serious, watchful. From the very beginning, Marcus was different. He didn't cry much. He didn't demand attention. He just observed, taking in the world with eyes that seemed too old for his tiny face. Richard didn't know what to make of him. Where Daniel was loud and confident, Marcus was silent and reserved. Where Daniel craved the spotlight, Marcus shrank from it. Where Daniel made friends effortlessly, Marcus preferred to be alone with his thoughts. Richard tried at first to mold Marcus into a copy of Daniel. He signed him up for the same sports, put him in the same activities, pushed him toward the same social groups. But Marcus wasn't Daniel. He didn't want to be Daniel. and the harder Richard pushed, the more Marcus withdrew. The tension might have been manageable if their mother had lived. Her name was Grace, and she was the only person who truly saw Marcus for who he was. She understood his quietness wasn't weakness, it was depth. She recognized that his serious nature wasn't a flaw, it was a gift. She held him when he was scared. She listened when he talked. She made him feel like he mattered, even when his father made him feel invisible. But Grace died when Marcus was 7 years old. Cancer. It came fast and left nothing behind but an empty chair at the dinner table and a hole in Marcus's heart that never fully healed. He remembered the last thing she said to him. She was lying in a hospital bed, her hand weak and trembling as she held his small fingers. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Marcus, my sweet boy, promise me something." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Promise me you'll always remember who you are, no matter what anyone says, no matter how they try to make you feel. You are strong, you are kind, you are enough. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that." He promised. He meant it. But keeping that promise was harder than he ever imagined. Because after Grace died, everything changed. Richard fell apart. He wasn't equipped to handle grief. He didn't know how to process his own pain, let alone help two young boys process theirs. So he did what many broken men do. He buried himself in work, in distraction, in anything that kept him from feeling. And when he did interact with his sons, all his attention went to Daniel. Daniel who reminded him of happier times. Daniel who smiled like Grace used to smile. Daniel who was easy to love because he reflected back everything Richard wanted to see. Marcus reminded Richard of grief, of loss, of the wife he couldn't save. Looking at Marcus was painful, so Richard stopped looking. He stopped asking about Marcus's day. He stopped showing up to Marcus's school events. He stopped pretending to be interested in the quiet boy who sat in the corner reading books while Daniel played sports and won trophies. The message was clear, even if Richard never said it out loud. Daniel was the son who mattered. Marcus was just there. Marcus tried to earn his father's attention. God, how he tried. He studied harder than anyone in his class, hoping good grades would make Richard proud. But Richard barely glanced at his report cards before turning back to Daniel's trophies. He taught himself to fix things around the house, the leaky faucet, that broken porch step, the car that kept stalling, hoping Richard would notice his usefulness. But Richard just grunted acknowledgement and walked away. He stayed out of trouble, never complained, never asked for anything. He thought maybe if he was perfect, if he was no burden at all, his father would finally see him. Richard didn't see him. Richard saw through him. By the time Marcus was 15, he had stopped trying. The hope that had once flickered in his chest, the hope that someday his father would love him the way he loved Daniel, had been extinguished completely. He was invisible. He had accepted it. High school was a blur of quiet survival. Marcus kept his head down, did his work, avoided attention. He had no close friends, not because no one liked him, but because he had learned to keep people at a distance. Connection meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant pain. He had enough pain. Daniel, meanwhile, thrived. Captain of the football team, homecoming king, scholarship offers pouring in from universities across the country. Richard attended every game, every ceremony, every milestone. He took photos, he made speeches, he told everyone who would listen about his incredible son. When people asked about his other son, Richard would pause, like he had forgotten Marcus existed. "Oh, Marcus, yeah, he's fine. Quiet kid, keeps to himself." That was all.
That was the summary of Marcus's entire existence in his father's eyes. Fine. Quiet. Keeps to himself. Not worth mentioning? Not worth remembering. Marcus graduated high school with decent grades, not exceptional, not terrible, just enough to get by. Richard didn't attend the ceremony. He was busy with something related to Daniel's college preparation. He sent a text that said, "Congrats." No exclamation point, no follow-up. Just a single word that felt more like an obligation than a celebration. Marcus stared at that text for a long time. Then he deleted it. That summer, Marcus made a decision. He was 18 years old. He had no money, no real plan, no father who cared what happened to him. He had nothing to lose. So he enlisted in the military. Richard laughed when he found out. Not a proud laugh, not an amused laugh, a dismissive, contemptuous laugh. "The military?" he said, shaking his head. "Of course. That's where kids go when they can't do anything else. When they have no other options. Makes sense." Marcus didn't respond. He had stopped expecting anything different. "Don't come crying to me when you wash out. I'm not bailing you out. You made your choice. Live with it." Marcus looked at his father. Really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in years. He saw a man consumed by his own disappointments. A man who measured worth in trophies and degrees. A man who was so broken by grief that he had broken his own son to avoid feeling it. And in that moment, Marcus felt something unexpected. Not anger, not sadness, pity. He pitied his father, because Richard would never know what he had lost. He would never understand the son he had thrown away. And that was Richard's tragedy, not Marcus's. "Goodbye, Dad," Marcus said quietly. Richard barely looked up. "Yeah, good luck or whatever." Marcus walked out of that house with a single duffel bag over his shoulder and no intention of ever looking back. He didn't know what the military would bring. He didn't know if he would succeed or fail. He didn't know who he would become. But he knew one thing for certain. He was done being invisible. He was done being a ghost in his own family. From this moment on, he would build a life that mattered, even if no one ever knew about it. And that decision, made by a broken 18-year-old with nothing to lose, would turn Marcus into one of the most extraordinary soldiers in American history. But that part of the story? That's still coming. Marcus arrived at basic training with nothing but a duffel bag, a chip on his shoulder, and a lifetime of pain he didn't know how to process. He expected the military to be hard. He expected the drill sergeants to scream, the physical demands to push him to his limits, the mental challenges to test every ounce of his resolve. But what he didn't expect was to feel at home. For the first time in his life, Marcus was surrounded by people who didn't care about his family. They didn't care that his father was disappointed in him. They didn't care that his brother was the golden child. They didn't care about anything except one simple question. Can you do the job? And Marcus could do the job. He could do it better than almost anyone else. The drill sergeants noticed him within the first week, not because he was loud or flashy. He wasn't. He never tried to stand out. He never sought attention or praise. He just did what needed to be done, quietly and efficiently, without complaint. When other recruits collapsed from exhaustion during 12-mile ruck marches, Marcus kept moving. When others panicked during combat simulations, Marcus stayed calm. When others cracked under the psychological pressure of sleep deprivation and constant criticism, Marcus absorbed it like water soaking into sand. He had been trained for this his whole life. He just didn't know it. Growing up invisible had taught him to observe, to adapt, to endure without breaking.
Growing up dismissed had taught him that external validation meant nothing. The only approval that mattered was his own. Growing up unloved had taught him to find strength within himself, because no one else was going to give it to him. The military didn't see a failure when they looked at Marcus. They saw potential. Raw, untapped, extraordinary potential. By the end of basic training, Marcus had distinguished himself as one of the top recruits in his class. His commanding officers recommended him for advanced infantry training, then airborne school, then ranger school. Each step was harder than the last. Each challenge pushed him further than he thought possible. And each time, Marcus rose to meet it. He wasn't the fastest soldier. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the smartest in terms of book knowledge or test scores, but he had something that couldn't be taught. He had an unshakable calm in the face of chaos. He had the ability to think clearly when everyone around him was falling apart. He had a quiet leadership that made other soldiers want to follow him, even when he never asked them to. And he had something else, something that would define his entire military career. He didn't fear death. Not because he was reckless, not because he didn't value life, but because he had already experienced the worst thing he could imagine, being invisible to the people who were supposed to love him. After that, what was death? Just another form of silence, just another kind of disappearing. Except this time, the disappearing would mean something. It would protect people. It would save lives. It would matter. 3 years into his service, Marcus was approached by men he had never seen before. They wore no unit insignia. They carried no identification. They spoke in vague terms about special assignments and unique opportunities and candidates with exceptional psychological profiles. They asked if he would be interested in serving his country in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged, ways that would require absolute secrecy, ways that would demand sacrifices most people couldn't imagine. Marcus said yes without hesitation. What did he have to lose? His father already thought he was worthless. His brother barely knew he existed. He had no girlfriend, no wife, no children waiting for him at home. He was a ghost in his own family. He might as well be a ghost for his country. The training that followed made everything before it look like summer camp. Marcus was sent to classified facilities in locations he was never told. He was pushed beyond every physical and mental limit he thought he had. He was taught skills that most soldiers never learn. Advanced combat techniques, covert infiltration, survival in hostile environments, interrogation resistance, explosive ordnance disposal, languages, disguises, and 100 other things he could never discuss with anyone outside his unit. He was broken down and rebuilt. His identity was stripped away and reconstructed. He became something more than a soldier. He became a weapon. A weapon that thought for itself. A weapon that could adapt to any situation. A weapon that could be inserted into the most dangerous environments on Earth and trusted to complete the mission no matter the cost. His first real assignment came 8 months later. The details are still classified. What can be said is this. Marcus and his team were dropped into a hostile region where American soldiers were not supposed to be. Their mission was to extract a high-value asset, a scientist who had information critical to national security, before enemy forces could capture or kill him. Everything went wrong from the moment they hit the ground. Their insertion point was compromised. Enemy forces were waiting. 2 members of Marcus's team were wounded in the first 30 seconds of the firefight. In the chaos that followed, most soldiers would have frozen. Most soldiers would have retreated. Most soldiers would have called for extraction and accepted that the mission was a failure. Marcus did none of those things. He assessed the situation in seconds. He gave calm, clear orders that cut through the panic. He single-handedly provided covering fire while his wounded teammates were dragged to safety. Then he did something insane. He went forward, alone, into the compound where the scientist was being held. He moved like a shadow through enemy lines. He neutralized threats with surgical precision. He found the scientist, terrified, certain he was about to die, and carried him out of that compound on his back while bullets tore through the air around them. By the time extraction arrived, Marcus had saved the scientist, saved his wounded teammates, and eliminated a dozen enemy combatants. He had taken 2 bullets himself, one in the shoulder, one in the leg, but he never stopped moving. He never complained. He never even mentioned his injuries until a medic noticed the blood soaking through his uniform. That mission earned Marcus his first major commendation, a medal that would never appear in any public record, an honor that would never be announced in any ceremony, a recognition that existed only in classified files, read by people whose names Marcus would never know. It was the first of many. Over the next decade, Marcus became a legend in the special operations community. Not a public legend, he would never be featured in movies or books or news articles, but among the men and women who served in the shadows, his name carried weight. They called him the Ghost, partly because of how he moved, silent, invisible, untraceable, partly because of his demeanor, calm, quiet, almost eerily composed even in the worst situations, and partly because of the way he seemed to exist between worlds, present but not present, there but not there, a man who had mastered the art of being invisible. The same invisibility that had caused him so much pain as a child had become his greatest weapon. He completed missions that would never be declassified. He saved lives that would never know they had been saved. He killed enemies that would never be publicly identified. He operated in countries where American military presence was officially denied. He was captured once, held for 11 days by forces that wanted information he would never give. He endured things during those 11 days that he still couldn't talk about, things that would have broken most men permanently. When his team finally extracted him, he was barely alive, 60 pounds underweight, bones broken, body covered in wounds that would leave scars for the rest of his life. The military doctors said he would never return to active duty. They said his body was too damaged. They said his mind had surely been shattered by the trauma he endured. Marcus was back in the field in 4 months. He didn't return out of recklessness or bravado. He returned because his team needed him, because there were missions that only he could complete, because the work mattered more than his comfort, more than his safety, more than his life. That is who Marcus had become, a man who measured his worth not by medals or recognition, but by the lives he saved and the missions he completed, a man who had found purpose in service, a man who had built himself into something extraordinary, not to prove anything to his father, but because it was who he chose to be. But his father knew none of this. To Richard, Marcus was still the failure, the dropout, the son who joined the army because he had no other options. Whenever Marcus came home on leave, which wasn't often, Richard barely acknowledged him. He would grunt a greeting, ask a few obligatory questions, then turn his attention back to Daniel's latest achievements. "So, still doing army stuff," Richard would say dismissively. Marcus would nod. "Yeah, still doing army stuff. Any promotions? Any progress?" Marcus couldn't answer honestly. His rank was classified. His unit was classified. His entire existence within the military was classified. "Just doing my job, Dad." Richard would shake his head, disappointment etched into every line of his face. "I don't know, Marcus. I thought the
military would make something out of you, but you're still just drifting. No real career, no family, nothing to show for yourself." Marcus would say nothing. What could he say? He couldn't explain that he had received personal commendations from generals whose names appeared in history books. He couldn't describe the missions that had changed the course of international conflicts. He couldn't show the medals locked in classified vaults, the letters of gratitude from government officials,
the lives that continued because of sacrifices he had made in silence. So he absorbed his father's contempt like he had absorbed bullets and beatings and torture. He let it wash over him without response. And he told himself it didn't matter. Most of the time, he even believed it. But sometimes, late at night when the nightmares came, and the faces of the dead visited him in his sleep, Marcus would wonder what it would feel like to be seen. Just once. To have his father understand who he really was. What he had really done. What he had really become. He never expected that day to come. He had made peace with invisibility. He had accepted that his sacrifices would remain secret forever. But fate had other plans. And the colonel standing at that podium, staring at Marcus with recognition in his eyes, was about to change everything.
Marcus almost didn't come to the graduation. He had been stateside for 3 weeks, a rare stretch of downtime between deployments. His body was still recovering from his last mission, extraction operation in a region he would never be allowed to name. He had fresh scars on his ribs and a shoulder that still ached when the weather changed. The smart thing would have been to rest, to stay in his small apartment, read books, sleep, and prepare for whatever came next. But Daniel had called. His younger brother, the golden child, the family star, the son their father actually loved, had personally asked Marcus to come. "It would mean a lot to me," Daniel had said, his voice sincere. "I know things are weird with Dad. I know he's difficult. But you're my brother, Marcus. I want you there." Marcus had hesitated. Every interaction with his father was painful. Every family gathering was a reminder of everything he had never been, at least in Richard's eyes. But Daniel had never been cruel to him. Daniel had never looked at him with contempt. If anything, Daniel seemed genuinely confused by their father's treatment of Marcus. He had never understood why Richard favored him so completely, and to his credit, he had never exploited it. Daniel was innocent, caught in the middle of a dynamic he hadn't created and couldn't control, and he wanted his brother at his graduation. Marcus couldn't say no to that. So here he was, sitting in a crowded auditorium, surrounded by proud families and excited graduates, wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks that made him look like any other unremarkable guest. He had arrived early, chosen a seat in the middle of the crowd, and done what he did best: disappeared. No one looked at him twice. No one wondered who he was. He was just another face in the sea of faces. Invisible. Forgettable. Exactly as he intended. Then his father arrived. Richard. Richard walked into the auditorium like he owned the place. He was wearing an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had never doubted his own importance. He spotted Marcus immediately. Not because he was looking for him, but because Marcus was sitting in the seat Richard had apparently decided should be his. "Move over," Richard said, not bothering with a greeting. Marcus slid one seat to the left without comment. Richard sat heavily down, already scanning the room for people worth talking to. His eyes swept over the crowd, lingering on anyone who looked wealthy or important, dismissing everyone else. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't ask how he was doing. He didn't acknowledge his existence beyond the command to move. Marcus was used to it. The ceremony began with the usual formalities: welcoming remarks from the university president, a speech from the dean, musical performances from the school orchestra. Marcus sat quietly through all of it, his mind drifting between the present moment and memories of places far away. Deserts and jungles and mountains where he had fought and bled and survived.
He was pulled back to reality when his father leaned over and spoke. "There he is, Marcus. Third row from the front. See him?" Marcus looked. Daniel was sitting with his fellow graduates, wearing his cap and gown, looking happy and confident. He was scanning the crowd, probably looking for family. When his eyes found Marcus, he smiled and gave a small wave. Marcus waved back. Something warm flickered in his chest. Genuine happiness for his brother. Daniel had worked hard for this. He deserved to celebrate. But then Richard spoke again, and the warmth turned to ice. "That's what success looks like, Marcus." The words were casual, almost offhand, like Richard was commenting on the weather rather than delivering a blow that would leave bruises. Top of his class, full scholarship, already got 3 job offers lined up, and he hasn't even officially graduated yet. Richard shook his head slowly, a smile playing at his lips. "That's my boy. I always knew he'd do great things. From the day he was born, I could tell he was special." The unspoken comparison hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus said nothing. "You know what the difference is between you and your brother?" Richard continued, still not looking at Marcus. "Ambition. Drive, the willingness to actually make something of yourself instead of just existing." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Daniel set goals. He worked towards them. He didn't make excuses or take the easy way out. Richard finally turned to look at Marcus, his eyes cold. "You didn't just give up and join the army because you couldn't hack it in the real world." There it was. The familiar knife, slipped between the ribs with practiced precision. Marcus had heard variations of this speech 100 times. Each time, Richard found new ways to phrase the same message. You are a disappointment. You are a failure. You will never be enough. "I didn't give up," Marcus said quietly. It was more than he usually offered, more than he should have offered. Richard laughed. A short, dismissive sound. "Please, you barely graduated high school. You couldn't get into a real college. You had no skills, no prospects, no future. The military was the only place that would take you." He shook his head again. "I'm not saying it's shameful. Someone has to do that work, I suppose. But let's not pretend it's an achievement. It's what people do when they have no other options." Marcus's felt the old familiar pain. The pain of being unseen, unvalued, unloved by the man who was supposed to love him unconditionally. But beneath the pain, something else stirred. Anger. Not the hot, explosive anger that makes people yell and throw things. A cold, quiet anger that had been building for decades. An anger that said, "You have no idea who I am. You have no idea what I've done. You have no idea that I've saved more lives than you've ever touched, that the son you call a failure is worth more than you will ever understand." But Marcus didn't say any of that. He couldn't. His service was classified. His sacrifices were secret. His entire identity as a soldier existed in a world his father couldn't access. So he swallowed the anger. He buried it with all the other things he had learned to bury. And he sat in silence while his father continued to twist the knife. "I just don't understand where I went wrong with you," Richard said, his voice taking on a theatrical tone of wounded confusion. "I gave you the same opportunities as Daniel, the same upbringing, the same support. And yet," he sighed heavily, "you turned out like this. Like this. Like a failure. Like a disappointment. Like nothing." Marcus stared straight ahead, his face carefully blank. Inside, something was cracking. He had told himself he was done seeking his father's approval. He had told himself it didn't matter anymore. But hearing these words, here, now, at what should have been a happy family occasion,
Marcus realized the wound had never fully healed. It had just scarred over, waiting for the right pressure to tear it open again. Richard was still talking, but Marcus had stopped listening. He focused on his breathing. In and out. Slow and steady. The same technique he used in combat to stay calm when everything was falling apart. He could endure this. He had endured worse. He had been shot, stabbed, beaten, tortured. He had watched friends die in his arms. He had made impossible decisions that would haunt him forever. He could survive his father's cruelty for a few more hours. The ceremony continued. Speeches were given, names were called. One by one, graduates walked across the stage to receive their diplomas, each one greeted by applause and camera flashes. When Daniel's name was announced, Richard leaped to his feet, clapping and cheering louder than anyone else in the auditorium. "That's my son!" he shouted, pulling out his phone to record the moment. "That's my boy!" Marcus clapped too, genuinely happy for Daniel. He had worked hard for this. He deserved to celebrate. But he remained seated, quiet, invisible. No one would record this moment for him. No one would cheer his name. After Daniel received his diploma, the ceremony moved to its final segment, a special address from a guest speaker, a distinguished military officer who would talk about service, sacrifice, and the responsibilities of the graduating class. Marcus glanced at the program. Colonel James Warren. His blood ran cold. No, it couldn't be. He looked up at the stage, and there he was, Colonel James Warren in full dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had commanded
Soldiers in the most dangerous places on earth. Marcus knew that stride. He knew that face. He knew that voice. Colonel Warren had been his commanding officer on 3 separate deployments. He had witnessed Marcus's capabilities firsthand. He had recommended Marcus for some of the highest honors the military could bestow, honors that existed only in classified files, known only to those with the highest security clearances. And he had been there 5 years ago when Marcus had carried him out of a firefight that should have killed them both. The colonel owed Marcus his life. And now he was standing on stage, 20 feet away, about to give a speech to a crowd that included the father who thought Marcus was worthless. Marcus's heart pounded. He tried to make himself smaller, to sink into his seat, to become invisible the way he had trained himself to become invisible. Maybe the colonel wouldn't see him. The auditorium was huge. There were hundreds of people. Marcus was just one face in a sea of faces. It would be fine. It had to be fine. Colonel Warren reached the podium. He adjusted the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, preparing to deliver his remarks. And then his eyes stopped moving. They locked onto a single point in the audience. Onto Marcus. For a long, frozen moment, neither of them moved. The colonel's expression shifted, surprise, then recognition, then something that looked almost like a reverence. The audience began to murmur. People noticed the pause. They noticed the colonel staring at someone in the crowd. Richard frowned, glancing around. What's wrong with him? Why isn't he talking? Marcus couldn't breathe. He watched the colonel step away from the podium. He watched him walk to the edge of the stage. He watched him snap to attention, spine straight, chin high, every muscle locked in perfect military form. And then Colonel James Warren raised his hand and delivered a crisp, formal salute, directly at Marcus. The auditorium went silent. Every head turned. Hundreds of eyes landed on the quiet, unremarkable man in row 15. Richard's face went white. Daniel, still standing near the stage with his diploma, stared in confusion. And Marcus, the failure, the disappointment, the invisible son,
sat frozen as the highest-ranking officer in the room honored him in front of everyone. "What the hell?" Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked at Marcus like he had never seen him before. Because in a way, he hadn't. But he was about to.
The silence in that auditorium was deafening. Hundreds of people sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the quiet man in row 15. The man a decorated colonel had just saluted like he was a 4-star general. Marcus didn't move. He couldn't. His body had locked into the same stillness that had saved his life in countless combat situations. The ability to become perfectly still when everything around him was chaos. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was a college graduation ceremony, and every single person in the room was staring at him. Richard's mouth was hanging open. His face had gone from confusion to shock, his eyes darting between Marcus and the colonel like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. "What is happening?" Richard hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why is he saluting you?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't find words. His mind was racing, calculating options, searching for an exit strategy that didn't exist. There was no extraction team coming, no backup plan, no way to disappear into the shadows like he had done so many times before. He was exposed, completely, utterly exposed. On stage, Colonel Warren held his salute for what felt like an eternity. His eyes never left Marcus's face. There was something in his expression, gratitude, respect, and something else. Something that looked almost like relief, like he had been waiting years for this moment. Finally, the colonel lowered his hand. He turned back to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and cleared his throat. The audience remained silent, waiting, desperate to understand what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel began, his voice carrying through the auditorium with the authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in war. "I apologize for the interruption. I came here today to deliver a speech about service and sacrifice, about what it means to dedicate your life to something greater than yourself." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd before returning to Marcus. "But I find myself unable to continue without first acknowledging something, or rather, someone." The murmur started again. People shifted in their seats, craning their necks to get a better look at the mysterious man who had captured the colonel's attention. Richard leaned forward, his confusion slowly morphing into something else, curiosity, and the faintest hint of fear. Sitting in this auditorium is one of the finest soldiers I have ever had the privilege of serving with. A man whose name most of you will never know, whose face will never appear on the news, whose sacrifices will never be written about in history books. He shook his head slowly, emotion creeping into his voice. And that is exactly how he would want it, because this man does not serve for recognition. He does not fight for medals. He does what he does because it is right, because someone has to, because he has a courage and a conscience that most people cannot even begin to comprehend. Marcus felt heat rising in his face. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to get up and walk out before this went any further. But his legs wouldn't move. His body refused to obey. "I'm not supposed to be telling you any of this," the colonel admitted, a small smile playing at his lips. "Technically, what I'm about to say is classified, and tomorrow I'll probably get a very angry phone call from some very important people." He shrugged. "I don't care. Some things are more important than regulations. Some things need to be said, consequences be damned." He stepped away from the podium and walked to the very edge of the stage, looking directly at Marcus. "Sergeant Major Marcus Reynolds, would you please stand?" Marcus's heart stopped. Sergeant Major. The rank he had earned through years of blood and sacrifice. The rank that only exists in classified files unknown to anyone outside the special operations community. The rank his father had never known. The rank his father thought didn't exist. Richard's head whipped toward Marcus, his eyes wide. "Sergeant Major? That's
That's one of the... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Marcus didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his face a mask of controlled composure. I understand your reluctance, believe me, I do. You have spent your entire career in the shadows. You've never sought attention. You've never asked for recognition. That's one of the things that makes you extraordinary. He paused. But today, I'm asking you to stand. Not for me, not for yourself, but for every soldier who has ever served in silence, every warrior whose sacrifices will never be known, every hero who walks among us, invisible and unrecognized. He extended his hand toward Marcus. Please, let me honor you the way you deserve to be honored. The auditorium was holding its breath. 1,000 eyes were fixed on Marcus, waiting, wondering, desperate to see what would happen next. Slowly, so slowly, Marcus rose to his feet. He stood straight, his posture unconsciously shifting into the military bearing that had been drilled into him over decades of service. His face remained neutral, but anyone who knew how to look could see the emotion buried beneath the surface. Colonel Warren smiled, a genuine, warm smile. Thank you. He turned back to the audience, his voice growing stronger. What I'm about to tell you is a small fraction of this man's service, a tiny glimpse into a career that spans over 15 years of the most dangerous, most critical, most impossible missions our military has ever undertaken. He began to pace the stage, his words filling the auditorium. Marcus Reynolds enlisted in the United States Army at 18 years old. Within 3 years, he had distinguished himself as one of the most capable soldiers in his generation. He was recruited into special operations, the kind of units that don't officially exist, the kind of units that operate in places where American military presence is denied, the kind of units that do the jobs no one else can do. Richard was staring at Marcus with an expression that defied description. His mouth kept opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. His hands were trembling in his lap. Over the past 15 years, the colonel continued, Sergeant Major Reynolds has completed more successful missions than I can count. He has saved more lives than anyone in this room will ever know. He has been shot, stabbed, captured, tortured, and he never broke. He never gave up. He never stopped fighting. The audience gasped. Several people covered their mouths. Someone in the back let out a quiet sob. He has received commendations from the highest levels of military leadership. He holds decorations that most soldiers only dream of, medals that are awarded in secret, honors that never make the news, recognition that exists only in classified files. The colonel's cracked slightly, and 5 years ago, he saved my life. The auditorium went completely silent. Our unit was ambushed in hostile territory. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. I took a bullet to the chest. I was bleeding out on the ground, certain I was going to die. And this man, this quiet, unassuming man who never asks for anything, ran through enemy fire to reach me. He applied a tourniquet with one hand while returning fire with the other. He killed 6 enemy combatants in under 30 seconds. And then he picked me up, a 200-pound man in full combat gear, and he carried me 2 miles through hostile territory to the extraction point. Tears were streaming down the colonel's now. He didn't try to hide them. He had been shot twice during the firefight, once in the shoulder, once in the leg. He didn't mention his injuries until we were on the helicopter. He didn't even seem to notice them. He was too busy making sure I was okay. The colonel turned to face Marcus directly. You saved my life, Marcus. You saved the lives of everyone in our unit that day. You have saved more lives than any soldier I have ever known, and your country owes you a debt it can never repay. He raised his hand in another salute. I salute you. Not because regulations require it, but because you are the finest soldier I have ever served with, and it is the honor of my life to call you a brother in arms. For a long moment, nothing happened. The auditorium was frozen, suspended in a single breathless second. Then someone started clapping. Then another person. then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium had erupted into thunderous applause. People were rising to their feet, not just a few, but everyone. A standing ovation for the quiet man in row 15, the man they had overlooked, the man they had dismissed, the man who had been sitting among them invisible and unrecognized, carrying secrets that would change how they saw him forever. Daniel was clapping the hardest, tears streaming down his face. He was looking at Marcus with an expression of overwhelming pride and awe, like he was seeing his brother clearly for the first time. But Richard wasn't clapping. Richard was sitting frozen in his seat, his face pale as a ghost. His eyes were fixed on Marcus with an expression that shifted between shock, confusion, shame, and something that might have been the beginning of horror. The horror of realizing what he had done. The horror of understanding, finally, who his son really was. And the horror of knowing that he had spent a lifetime tearing down the greatest man he would ever know. Marcus stood in the middle of the standing ovation, surrounded by applause and cheers, his face still carefully controlled, but inside,
Something was breaking open. Something he had kept locked away for decades. He wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time in his life, everyone could see him. And his father, the man who had called him a failure just minutes ago, was watching with the shattered expression of a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed. The colonel lowered his salute and smiled. "Welcome to the light, brother," he said quietly, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "You've earned it." Marcus didn't smile back. He couldn't. Not yet. Because the applause was wonderful, the recognition was overwhelming, but there was still one thing left to do. One conversation that had been waiting his entire life. He looked at his father, and Richard, for the first time in 34 years, looked away.
The applause seemed to last forever. Wave after wave of sound crashed over Marcus, washing through him like water through a broken dam. People were cheering. Some were crying. Complete strangers were looking at him with admiration, with respect, with something that looked almost like awe. It was everything he had never asked for, everything he had never wanted. And yet, standing there in the middle of that auditorium, surrounded by people who finally saw him, Marcus felt nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, not joy, just emptiness. Because the only person whose recognition had ever truly mattered was sitting 3 feet away, staring at the floor like a man who had just watched his entire world crumble to dust. Richard, his father, the man who had spent 34 years making Marcus feel worthless, the man who had dismissed every choice Marcus ever made, the man who had looked at his own son and seen nothing but failure, disappointment, and shame. That man was now sitting in stunned silence, his face drained of color, his hands trembling in his lap. He couldn't even look up, couldn't meet Marcus's eyes, couldn't face the truth that had just been revealed to the entire room. The applause finally began to fade. People returned to their seats, still murmuring, still glancing at Marcus with wonder. The colonel stepped back to the podium, said a few more words about service and sacrifice that Marcus barely heard, and concluded the ceremony. Graduates threw their caps in the air. Families rushed toward the stage to embrace their loved ones. The auditorium dissolved into chaos, happy, celebratory chaos, that swirled around Marcus like a storm he wasn't part of. Daniel found him first. His younger brother pushed through the crowd, tears still streaming down his face, and threw his arms around Marcus in a fierce embrace. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel choked out, his voice muffled against Marcus's shoulder. "All these years, why didn't you ever say anything?" Marcus hugged him back, holding tight for a moment before pulling away. "I couldn't," he said quietly. "It was classified. Still is, technically. The colonel's going to be in trouble for what he said today." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "I don't care about classified. I care about you. My brother. My brother is a... He trailed off, like he still couldn't quite process it. A hero. An actual, real-life hero. And I had no idea. Marcus put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You were never supposed to know. That was the point. The work I do, it doesn't come with parades. It comes with silence, with secrecy, with being invisible so that other people can be safe. Daniel wiped his eyes. I'm so proud of you. I don't even have words. I'm so incredibly proud of you. For the first time since the colonel's speech began, Marcus felt something warm flicker in his chest. Not for himself, but for Daniel. For his little brother, who had never been cruel, never been dismissive, never looked at Marcus with anything but genuine affection. Daniel was innocent, caught in the middle of a family dynamic he hadn't created. And despite everything, despite growing up as the golden child, despite receiving all of their father's love and attention, Daniel had never stopped caring about his older brother. That meant something. That meant everything. Thank you, Marcus said softly. That means more than you know. Daniel nodded, sniffling. Then his expression shifted. His eyes moved past Marcus, toward the figure still sitting frozen in the row behind them. Dad hasn't moved, Daniel said quietly. He's just sitting there. I've never seen him like this. Marcus turned slowly. Richard was exactly where he had been throughout the entire standing ovation. Seated, motionless, staring at nothing. His face was a mask of shock. His hands gripped his knees like he was trying to anchor himself to reality. People were streaming past him, heading toward the exits, but Richard didn't seem to notice. He was somewhere else, somewhere inside his own head, somewhere that was collapsing. I need to talk to him, Marcus said. Daniel hesitated. Do you want me to come with you? Marcus shook his head. No, this is something I have to do alone. He took a breath, steadying himself the way he steadied himself before entering the hostile compound. Then he walked toward his father. The crowd parted around him. People who had been strangers 5 minutes ago now nodded at him with respect, stepped aside to let him pass, whispered words of gratitude and admiration that Marcus barely heard. He reached his father's row and stopped. Richard still didn't look up. Dad. The word hung in the air between them. Heavy. Loaded. Carrying 34 years of pain. Richard flinched. His shoulders tightened, but he didn't respond. Dad, Marcus said again. Look at me. Slowly, painfully slowly, Richard raised his head. His eyes met Marcus's, and in those eyes, Marcus saw something he had never seen before. Fear. Richard was afraid. Afraid of what Marcus would say. Afraid of what he had done. Afraid of facing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty and dismissal. Good. He should be afraid. We need to talk, Marcus said. His voice was calm, controlled. The same voice he used when giving orders in combat. Steady. Clear. Leaving no room for argument. Richard swallowed hard. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Outside. Now. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked toward the exit, trusting that his father would follow. And Richard did. Of course he did. Because for the first time in their lives, Marcus was the one in control. They found a quiet spot outside the auditorium. A small courtyard with benches and trees, temporarily empty as everyone else celebrated inside. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete. Birds sang in the distance. It would have been peaceful under different circumstances. Marcus stopped walking. He turned to face his father. Richard stood a few feet away, looking smaller than Marcus had ever seen him. The arrogance was gone. The confidence had evaporated. He was just a man. A flawed, broken man who had just realized the magnitude of his mistakes.
For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard's voice came out, weak and trembling. Marcus, I don't know what to say. That's a first, Marcus replied quietly. You've always had plenty to say. Plenty of observations about how I don't measure up to Daniel. Plenty of ways to remind me that I'm not the son you wanted. Richard flinched. I never meant... You never meant what? Marcus cut him off, his voice sharpening. You never meant to spend my entire childhood ignoring me? You never meant to miss every important moment of my life while you celebrated Daniel's? You never meant to tell me I was worthless, to laugh at my choices, to make me feel like I was a burden you were stuck with instead of a son you loved. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Marcus, please. Do you know what it's like? Marcus continued, the words pouring out of him now like water from a broken dam. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up invisible in your own home? To beg for your father's attention and get nothing but disappointment? To try so hard to make him proud and fail every single time? His voice cracked, but he pushed through. I was a child, Dad. A child. And all I ever wanted was for you to see me, to love me, to tell me that I mattered. But you couldn't do that, could you? You were too busy worshiping Daniel, too busy grieving Mom, too busy being angry at the world to notice that your other son was drowning right in front of you. Richard was crying now. Tears streamed down his weathered face, dripping onto his expensive suit. I know I failed you. I know I was a terrible father to you. After your mother died, I didn't know how to... Don't, Marcus said sharply. Don't use Mom as an excuse. I lost her too. I was 7 years old when she died, Dad. 7. And instead of comforting me, instead of helping me through it, you disappeared. You checked out. You poured everything into Daniel because he was easier, because he reminded you of happier times, because loving him didn't hurt as much as loving me. He took a step closer, his eyes burning with decades of suppressed pain. You abandoned me. Your own son. You abandoned me emotionally, and I spent my entire childhood trying to figure out what was wrong with me, why I wasn't enough, why I couldn't make you love me no matter what I did. Richard shook his head frantically. There was never anything wrong with you. Never. I was the broken one. I was the one who couldn't cope. I was the one who pushed you away because looking at you reminded me of everything I had lost. That's not an excuse.
Marcus's voice rose, echoing off the courtyard walls. That's an explanation, maybe, but it's not an excuse. You were my father. You were supposed to protect me, to guide me, to show me what it means to be a man. And instead, you taught me that I was worthless, that I would never be enough, that no matter what I accomplished, I would always be the family disappointment. He paused, breathing hard, forcing himself to regain control. Do you want to know why I enlisted? Do you want to know why I joined the army straight out of high school? Richard nodded weakly, tears still falling. Because I had nowhere else to go, Marcus said quietly. Because my own home felt more hostile than a war zone. Because I would rather face bullets and bombs and torture than spend another day living under your roof, being reminded every single day that I wasn't the son you wanted. Richard let out a sob, a raw, ugly sound that echoed through the empty courtyard. I'm sorry, he choked out. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I know it's not enough. I know nothing I say can undo what I did. But please, please believe me when I say I'm sorry. Marcus stared at his father, this broken, weeping man who had caused him so much pain. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, dreamed about what he would say if his father ever apologized, fantasized about the satisfaction of finally being vindicated. But now that it was happening, he felt no satisfaction, no triumph, no joy, just exhaustion. and the faintest flicker of something that might have been pity. "Do you know what the hardest part was?" Marcus asked softly. Richard looked up, his face a mess of tears and regret. "The hardest part wasn't the combat. It wasn't the injuries. It wasn't the torture or the nightmares or the friends I watched die." Marcus's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The hardest part was knowing that no matter what I did, no matter how many lives I saved, how many medals I earned, how many sacrifices I made, it would never be enough for you. Because you had already decided I was a failure, and nothing could change that." Richard's face crumpled. He looked like a man who had just been shown the full weight of his sins and found himself unable to bear it. "You were never a failure, Richard. Never. I was the failure. I failed you in every way a father can fail his son, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting it." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The courtyard seemed frozen in time. Just the two of them, standing in the wreckage of 34 years of pain. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I spent most of my life hating you. Then I spent years trying to stop hating you, trying to make peace with who you are, trying to accept that I would never have the father I needed. I'm not sure I've succeeded, but I know one thing for certain." Richard looked up, his face a mess of tears and regret. "I don't need your approval anymore." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, bracing himself against a nearby bench. "I spent decades seeking your validation, killing myself trying to earn your respect. And today, when that colonel saluted me, when the whole auditorium stood and cheered, I realized something. Their recognition felt good, but it didn't heal anything. Because the wound you created can't be healed by applause." Richard opened his mouth, but Marcus held up a hand. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying this because it's true. You broke something in me a long time ago, Dad. Something that medals and missions and standing ovations can't fix. And I finally accepted that. I forgive you. Not for your sake, for mine. Carrying this anger, this pain, this need for your approval, it's exhausting. And I'm done. I'm letting it go." Richard's tears fell faster. "Marcus, I don't deserve your forgiveness." "No," Marcus agreed quietly. "You don't. But I'm giving it anyway. Because that's who I am. That's who I chose to become. Not because of you, but in spite of you." He stepped back, creating distance between them. "But forgiveness isn't reconciliation, and it isn't trust. Those things have to be earned. And honestly, Dad, I don't know if you can earn them. I don't know if you're even capable of being the father I needed." Richard nodded slowly, painfully. "I understand, and I do, and I want to try, if you'll let me. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I want to try to be better. To know the real you. To be part of your life, if you'll have me." Marcus studied his father's face. The arrogance was gone. The dismissiveness had vanished. For the first time in his life, Richard looked humble, broken. But maybe, just maybe, open to change. "We'll see," Marcus said finally. "I'm not making any promises, but we'll see." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a fresh start. It was barely even a beginning. But it was something. A crack in the wall. A door left slightly ajar. Richard nodded, wiping his eyes. Thank you, Marcus. I don't know what else to say." "Then don't say anything. Just go back inside. Celebrate Daniel's graduation. Be the father to him that you never were to me." Richard flinched at the words, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, turned and walked slowly back toward the auditorium. His shoulders were slumped. His head was bowed.
He looked like a man who had just been shown the full weight of his sins and found himself unable to bear it. Marcus watched him go. When his father disappeared through the doors, Marcus let out a long, slow breath. He felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but lighter. Like a weight he had been carrying his entire life had finally been acknowledged. And maybe, just maybe, could start to be lifted. He turned and walked away from the auditorium, away from the celebration, away from the family that had never truly felt like his. The afternoon sun was warm on his face. The birds were still singing. And for the first time in 34 years, Marcus felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not hope for his father's redemption. Not hope for the family he never had. But hope for himself. For the future. For the man he was still becoming. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if Richard would change or if their relationship could ever be repaired. He didn't know if the wounds of his childhood would ever fully heal. But he knew one thing. He was done being invisible. He was done seeking validation from people who couldn't give it. He was done measuring his worth by his father's broken standards. From now on, he would measure his worth by his own standards, by the lives he saved, by the man he chose to be, by the quiet, steady courage that had carried him through impossible situations. The applause in that auditorium felt good. But this moment of walking away, of choosing himself, of finally breaking free, felt better. Marcus smiled. A small smile. A private smile. The smile of a man who had finally found the one thing he had been searching for his entire life. Not his father's approval. His own.
The weeks that followed Daniel's graduation were strange and unfamiliar for Marcus. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't preparing for a mission. He wasn't training. He wasn't disappearing into the shadows to do the work that no one would ever know about. He was just existing. And he didn't quite know what to do with that. The colonel's speech had consequences, just as Marcus had predicted. There were phone calls from very serious people in very important offices. There were meetings with officials who expressed their displeasure at the breach of classified information. There were discussions about protocols and security clearances and the importance of maintaining operational secrecy. But in the end, nothing happened. Colonel Warren had too much influence, too many friends in high places, and too spotless a record for anyone to seriously punish him. And Marcus was too valuable, too decorated, too respected within the special operations community for anyone to make an example of him. The matter was quietly dropped. Files were sealed. The official position became that the colonel had spoken in generalities, that no specific classified information had been revealed, that the whole incident was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Marcus didn't care about the politics. He never had. What he cared about was what came next. For the first time in 15 years, he had been seen, not just by his father, not just by Daniel, but by the world, or at least a small corner of it. And that visibility changed things. It changed how he saw himself. Daniel called every day for the first 2 weeks, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask questions about Marcus's service, questions Marcus couldn't always answer, but tried to when he could. Sometimes just to say, "I'm thinking about you. I love you. I'm proud to be your brother." Those calls meant more to Marcus than he could express. He had always loved Daniel, even when his father's favoritism made their relationship complicated. But now, for the first time, they were building something new, a real brotherhood, an adult friendship built on honesty and mutual respect. Daniel wanted to know everything. He wanted to understand the years they had lost, the secrets Marcus had carried, the man his brother had become while he wasn't watching.
And Marcus, slowly and carefully, began to open up. Not about the classified details, those would always remain secret, but about the emotions, the fears, the loneliness, the pride and the pain of serving in silence. "I wish I had known," Daniel said during one of their calls. "I wish I could have been there for you, supported you, understood what you were going through." "You couldn't have known," Marcus replied gently. "That was the whole point. And honestly, you did support me, just by being who you are, just by never treating me the way Dad did." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's different now, you know, Dad. Something broke in him that day. I've never seen him like this." Marcus had noticed. Richard had been calling too. Not every day. Marcus suspected he was afraid to push too hard, but regularly. Once or twice a week. Short calls at first. Awkward, stilted conversations about nothing in particular, the weather, sports, safe topics that didn't venture anywhere near the minefield of their past. But gradually, the calls got longer, more personal, more honest. "I've been thinking a lot," Richard said during one call, about a month after the graduation, "about you, about us, about everything I did wrong." Marcus listened without interrupting. "I was so blind," Richard continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I was so wrapped up in my own pain that I couldn't see yours. And by the time I realized what I was doing, it felt too late to change. So I just kept going, kept pushing you away, kept telling myself that you were the problem, not me. I was wrong about everything. You were never a failure, Marcus. You were never a disappointment. I was the failure. I was the disappointment. And I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." Marcus closed his eyes, letting his father's words wash over him. They didn't erase the past. They couldn't undo 34 years of pain, but they were something. A beginning, an acknowledgement, a first step on a very long road. "I hear you, Dad, and I appreciate you saying that. I really do." "But," Richard's voice was tentative, afraid. "But words are easy. Change is hard. And I've spent my whole life watching you say one thing and do another. So I'm not going to pretend everything is okay just because you apologized. I need to see it. I need to see you actually change, actually show up, actually be the father you should have been." Richard was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I understand. And I will. I promise you, Marcus, I will. I will spend the rest of my life proving that I can be better." "We'll see," Marcus said. The same words he had said in the courtyard. The same cautious hope. The same refusal to make promises he might not be able to keep. The calls continued, and slowly, so slowly, things began to shift. Richard started asking about Marcus's life. Not just the military stuff, his actual life, his hobbies, his interests, his hopes for the future. He started listening instead of lecturing. He started showing curiosity instead of judgment. He even apologized specifically and unprompted for individual incidents from Marcus's childhood. The time he missed Marcus's 8th grade graduation. The time he laughed at Marcus's dream of becoming a pilot. The time he told Marcus he would never amount to anything. Each apology was a small brick removed from the wall between them. Not enough to tear it down, but enough to create cracks. Enough to let light through. He didn't trust it completely. Part of him was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Richard to revert to his old ways, to prove that people really don't change, that the apologies were just temporary guilt that would fade with time. But another part of him, a small, hopeful part that he had almost forgotten existed, wondered if maybe, just maybe, this time was different. Maybe his father really was trying. Maybe people could change, even after a lifetime of being broken. Maybe it wasn't too late. 3 months after the graduation, Marcus received an unexpected invitation. Richard was hosting a dinner at his home. Not a big party, just family. Marcus, Daniel, and Richard. A chance to sit together, share a meal, and try to rebuild something that had been destroyed long ago.
Marcus almost said no. The old instincts were strong. The instinct to protect himself, to keep his distance, to avoid situations where he might get hurt. But Daniel called and begged him to come. "Please," Daniel said. "I know it's hard. I know you have every reason to stay away, but I really think Dad is trying, and I think it would mean everything to him and to me if you gave him a chance." So Marcus went. The dinner was awkward at first. Stilted conversations, long silences, everyone trying too hard to be normal, to pretend that they were just a regular family having a regular meal. But then something happened. Richard stood up, walked to a cabinet in the corner of the dining room, and pulled out a small wooden box. "I've been holding on to this for a while. I wasn't sure when to give it to you, or if I even had the right to give it to you. But I think now is the time." He walked over to Marcus and set the box on the table in front of him. Marcus looked at it, confused. "What is this?" "Open it," Richard said. Marcus lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a pocket watch. Old, weathered, clearly an antique. Marcus recognized it immediately. His breath caught in his throat. "This was Grandpa's," he whispered. Richard nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "It was supposed to go to my firstborn son. That's you, Marcus. It was always supposed to be yours. I could never bring myself to give it to you. Every time I looked at it, I thought of my father, and I thought of all the ways I had failed to be the father he was, and I couldn't face that. But you deserve this. You always deserved this. You are the firstborn. You are my son, and I am so proud, so incredibly proud of the man you have become. Not because of the medals, not because of what the colonel said, but because you became that man despite me, despite everything I did to tear you down. You built yourself into someone extraordinary, and you did it on your own. That takes more strength than I will ever have." Marcus stared at the pocket watch, emotions flooding through him that he couldn't name. Grief, joy, pain, hope, love, all of it mixed together into something overwhelming. "Dad," he started, but his voice broke. Richard reached out and put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. It was the first time he had touched his son with affection in decades. "I know I can't undo the past," Richard said quietly. "I know words aren't enough, but I want you to know that I see you now. I finally see you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see." Marcus looked up at his father. The arrogance was gone. The coldness had melted. In its place was something Marcus had never seen before. Genuine love. Vulnerable, imperfect, long overdue love. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything Marcus had needed as a child, but it was real. And sometimes real is enough. Marcus stood and did something he
hadn't done since he was 7 years old. He hugged his father. Richard's arms wrapped around him, shaking, holding on like he was afraid Marcus would disappear. Daniel watched from across the table, tears streaming down his face, a smile breaking through the emotion. They stood like that for a long time, a father and son finally seeing each other, finally beginning to heal. When they finally separated, Marcus looked at the pocket watch in his hand. He ran his thumb over the worn metal, feeling the weight of history, of family, of everything it represented. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for this and for trying." Richard nodded, wiping his face. "Thank you for giving me the chance." They finished dinner that night as something they had never been before. A family. Not a perfect family, not a family without scars or history or pain, but a family that was trying, a family that was healing, a family that finally had a chance. Marcus drove home that night with the pocket watch in his pocket and something unfamiliar in his chest. Peace. Not complete peace, not the peace of someone whose wounds have fully healed, but the peace of someone who has finally stopped fighting a war that could never be won. He thought about everything he had been through, the childhood of invisibility, the years of seeking approval he would never get,
The military career that had shaped him into someone extraordinary, the confrontation with his father, the slow, painful process of rebuilding. And he realized something. He had spent his whole life being invisible, first in his family, then in his service. He had operated in the shadows, done the work that no one would ever see, sacrificed more than most people could imagine, all without recognition, without applause, without anyone knowing his name. But invisibility wasn't his curse, it was his gift. It had taught him to find strength within himself, to define his own worth, to become someone extraordinary without needing anyone else's validation. And now that he had been seen, now that the world knew who he was, he understood something important. Being seen didn't change who he was. It just confirmed it. He had always been enough. He had always mattered. He had just been waiting for the right people to notice. And the most important person who needed to notice? Himself. Marcus pulled into his driveway and sat in his car for a moment, looking at the stars. He thought about his mother, the woman who had told him all those years ago to never forget who he was. He had kept that promise. Through everything, the pain, the loneliness, the service, the sacrifice, he had never forgotten. And now, finally, he could say the words she had wanted him to believe. "I am enough," he whispered into the darkness. "I always was." He smiled. Not a big smile, not a triumphant smile. Just a quiet, peaceful smile. The smile of a man who had finally found what he was looking for. Not his father's approval, not the world's recognition, but his own acceptance, his own peace, his own understanding of who he was and what he was worth. And that was worth more than any medal, more than any standing ovation, more than any apology. Because the greatest victory isn't being seen by others, it's learning to see yourself. Marcus stepped out of his car, walked into his home, and closed the door behind him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, new opportunities to grow and heal and become. But tonight he was at peace. And for a man who had spent 34 years searching for something he couldn't name, that was more than enough.